Well, hello, friends. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Reading Michael Jackson. I am your host, Lena, and we're on episode 17. So we are moving right along through Dancing the Dream, and I'm so excited because we are nearing the halfway point. Now, before we get into today's episode, I do want to talk a little bit more about last week's. And the reason for that is because I'm currently going through a moment where I am very excitedly buying up used Michael Jackson books on eBay. And I'm doing this in part with a focus on buying books that were published within the 1980s. So specifically, I am interested in books that approach Michael Jackson, his status, his enigma, his artistry, what have you, during the height of his popularity. Now, don't get me wrong, Michael Jackson's fame and popularity as an artist never exactly faded, but I'm very interested in looking at kind of archival materials, so to speak, from before his celebrity became the bigger focus of his career than his artistry did. So I'm curious, how are people talking about Michael? What are they saying about Michael? What was the cultural consensus about him? And so because of that, I've purchased a couple of different books. I recently read the book Michael Jackson Thrill by Caroline Latham, and I'm currently reading On the Road with Michael by Mark Bego. And these are both really interesting books. They're little paperbacks. They have this like scrawly script on the front. They have almost like a Harlequin romance novel vibe to them, and which I'm not questioning, but the content is very interesting. Gives me some contextual understanding of the time period and Michael's fame and the way he was regarded. So anyway, as I was reading Caroline Latham's book, Michael Jackson Thrill, I noted when she was talking about the music videos during the Thriller era, specifically Billie Jean, the way she talks about magic. And I wanted to just share some of that with you. She writes that the video for Billie Jean, quote, emphasizes the singer's innocence and otherworldliness. He walks down the street in a halo of eerie white light, and everything that he touches takes on a brief and miraculous glow. She continues, the denouement depicts the triumph of a magical creature, which is what we now understand the singer to be. Later, she continues to write about Billie Jean, and she refers to the, quote, somehow friendly glow that Michael emits throughout the video, a visual signal that convinces without argument that Michael is no mere mortal. I liked those little quotes about Michael and his magical presence in the Billie Jean video. But on a different note, in On the Road with Michael Jackson by Mark Bego, the entire book is following Michael Jackson's road to the Victory Tour and, the entire process and journey of the early 1980s for Michael. So he talks about how Michael's unwillingness to be interviewed, his kind of shutting out of the major media at the time and not doing any cover stories, not doing any major interviews. He talks about how that just created a greater air of mystery and desire for him from the public, where people just constantly wanted more because he gave them so little in that sense. And so this one section of the book, he is referring to interviews conducted with all of Michael's siblings instead of Michael. So he talks about how the Jackson family sort of became spokespeople on behalf of Michael during a period of time because of this. So I thought this part was especially interesting. So when Michael's brother Jermaine was interviewed, the author says that he shared some very, quote, definite feelings about the immortality of true creativity, end quote. And he goes on to discuss a conversation that he had with Michael about longevity of creativity and of art. And Germain said, quote, "Michael and I got into a debate about Gandhi and E.T. That shows you the difference between us. He's into the magical world and loved E.T., but I felt that Gandhi would last longer as a classic because the public could feel that it was about something real. It's the difference between Dancing Machine and Never Can Say Goodbye. Never Can Say Goodbye will be around long after Dancing Machine is gone because it's about real feelings." I thought this was especially interesting given last week's conversation about magic and one of the previous week's conversations about legacy. Thinking about these things and thinking about Michael's career, thinking about what he valued most, which seemed to be magic as one of the main tenets of what he was striving for, I think this is fascinating because between E.T. and Gandhi, while both classic films, I would definitely suggest that E.T. has maintained more cultural prominence. In fact, just this past year or so was the 40th anniversary of E.T., and I've seen all kinds of E.T. dolls and t-shirts and, different reminders of E.T. as this like cultural moment. Not that you would ever have similar types of merchandise for Gandhi. But the point is that, I don't know, I think there's something kind of interesting about the fact that Michael's perspective was that this magical thing would last, and Germain's perspective was that the more realistic thing would. And I think he really perhaps underestimates the power of magic, the power of excitement and fantasy, and as Michael would say, wonderment. When I think about my own rewatching of E.T. last year, I think about how it was the first time I had watched this film since I was a child. And as a 30-something woman, I cried so hard, so many times. And I remember just gasping in complete, unmitigated delight when E.T. and Elliot fly into the sky in the bike. It just completely blew my mind to see it again. And I was filled with this like childlike response that I haven't experienced in a very, very long time with that film. And that certainly makes it something I want to revisit again and again. So I don't know. I guess I just have had this stuff on my mind in the last week since I last recorded. And I wanted to start there with that. Michael's view of magic and his own magical nature are things that we can certainly talk about for a long time, but perhaps there's also some wisdom in those things too. So now getting on to the focus of this week's episode, a very long intro, I do apologize. Getting on to this week's focus, we have what looks to be a short story or perhaps another parable. Sit back and relax. Enjoy this reading of The Fish That Was Thirsty. The Fish That Was Thirsty. One night, a baby fish was sleeping under some coral when God appeared to him in a dream. "I want you to go forth with a message to all the fish in the sea," God said. "What should I tell them?" the little fish asked. "Just tell them you're thirsty," God replied, "and see what they do." Then, without another word, he disappeared. The next morning, the little fish woke up and remembered his dream. "What a strange thing God wants me to do," he thought to himself. But as soon as he saw a large tuna swimming by, the little fish piped up, "Excuse me, but I'm thirsty." "Then you must be a fool," the tuna said, and with a disdainful flick of his tail, he swam away. The little fish did feel rather foolish, but he had had his orders. The next fish he saw was a grinning shark. Keeping a safe distance, the little fish called out, "Excuse me, sir, but I'm thirsty." "Then you must be crazy," the shark replied. Noticing a rather hungry look in the shark's eye, the little fish swam away quickly. All day he met cod and mackerels and swordfish and groupers, but every time he made his short speech, they turned their backs and would have nothing to do with him. Feeling hopelessly confused, the little fish sought out the wisest creature in the sea, who happened to be an old blue whale with 3 harpoon scars on his side. "Excuse me, but I'm thirsty," the little fish shouted, wondering if the old whale could even see him. He was such a tiny speck. But the wise one stopped in his tracks. "You've seen God, haven't you?" he said. "How did you know?" "Because I was thirsty once too," the old whale laughed. The little fish looked very surprised. "Please tell me what this message from God means," he implored. "It means that we are looking for him in the wrong places," the old whale explained. "We look high and low for God, but somehow he's not there. So we blame him and tell ourselves that he must have forgotten us, or else we decide he left a long time ago if he was ever around." "How strange," the little fish said, "to miss what is everywhere." "Very strange," the old whale agreed. "Doesn't it remind you of fish who say they're thirsty?" Well, I must say that I really enjoyed this piece. While I didn't remember initially what it was about, I really liked it. I found it very sweet. Just the description of the little fish sleeping under coral and going from place to place asking this question. There was something very endearing and innocent about that. And by extension, it's just very sweet to think about Michael writing this and thinking about this little fish and his journey to understanding. I'm curious, as always, what inspired Michael to write this particular piece. Now, I think it's pretty clear with this piece, more than many, in fact, that the message is similar to ones that I think we may have discussed in previous episodes about looking around you and seeing what's here and what we already have access to. I know that in the recent Heal the World episode, we talked about the line, "It's plain to see this world is heavenly." And I think that's kind of the point here too, right? Like, so we start with this little fish minding his own business. And then God comes to him and tells him what to do and to go telling the other fish that he's thirsty. And of course, every fish blows him off until one whale has enough kindness in his heart to help a poor, misguided little fish. So in that sense, by the whale telling him, "Look, of course it's silly that you're asking people this. You're surrounded by water." It's a great parable for this concept of God and God's presence everywhere we turn. Just like it's plain to see this world as heavenly. We are already here and experiencing it. Everywhere we look, we can see evidence of it. I think that's the point here. And so it's interesting because this is a bit of a more straightforward piece by Michael. In case there was any confusion, the whale says that looking for something to drink in an ocean full of water means we're looking for God in all the wrong places. We look high and low for God, but somehow he's not there, and so we blame him and tell ourselves that he must have forgotten us, or else we decide that he left us a long time ago. And this equation of our search for God to a search for something to drink in an ocean full of water is it's an interesting one, and it's an interesting choice for Michael to make, to directly state it like this. I was thinking about this, though, and though it is a fairly straightforward piece, there are a few things I'd like to just note about it. Firstly, like I said, I'm interested in what inspired him to write this. Obviously, Michael has been touching upon religion as well as faith in God. I would say, obviously, Michael has been touching upon a lot of spiritual and faithful types of themes that show a certain relationship he had to God and how he viewed God. But I can't help but wonder, this idea that we are looking for God in all of the wrong places, and we can feel forsaken and abandoned and as if there was no God or no presence before. It makes me wonder about Michael's own journey with faith. Obviously, we know he was a person who practiced religion, who did have a lot of beliefs and a lot of faith. He was raised as a Jehovah's Witness, and I know I've heard a lot of mixed stories from people about how he's separated from the Jehovah's Witnesses and if he actually ever fully did or not in terms of his own personal faith. I've heard very mixed things, so I'm not going to pretend to know. But it's clear, regardless of that he was always very open in talking about his feelings about God, his feelings about Jesus, all of these different really important figures within his faith. But that doesn't really tell us what his journey was like to get there. How a person is raised often has very little with how they arrive at their own faith. Like you can be raised and exposed to different ways of viewing life and the world and viewing faith, but that doesn't mean it penetrates. At least in my own experience, and the experience of a lot of people that I know, faith really becomes something, whatever you have faith in, whether that is God or something spiritual or the universe or yourself, there's often some sort of a trial for people that leads them to a stronger sense of understanding. And at this point, I'm really curious what that looked like for him. Was it that he just innately believed in it because he was raised to, or did he have some way of crediting his beliefs for saving him in some way? And if so, from what? And I don't mean that in a becoming saved kind of way. I mean that in terms of for him personally. I guess what I'm asking is, what was Michael Jackson's moment of realizing he was missing what was everywhere? He was not seeing God where he was looking because he was looking in the wrong places. When did that realization come for him? Or was it some innate thing that he understood? I have a hard time imagining that there wasn't a journey to reaching that understanding for him, but perhaps there wasn't. Either way, I do imagine that at this point in his life, in 1992, when this was published, this was after he had already endured quite a lot in his life, but before he would endure some of the lowest points also. And it does make me wonder how his own relationship to faith continued to progress after the publication of this book. So that's just kind of on my mind as one part of this. I also can't help but think about my own experiences with this kind of struggle and how this relates to some of the themes from the book so far, and this idea of finding beauty, finding love, finding spirituality, finding God, whatever you want to think of it as, finding it in everything rather than seeking for it to be made obvious for you. And the thing about that is that on one hand, when you think about it, it's everywhere, that should be obvious. But in another, we do, as human beings, get used to the conditions of our lives. We get used to the conditions from which we come, and it can be hard to see clearly what's there. And I know that not all of Michael Jackson's fans who read this are faithful or religious people. I'm not, actually, myself, despite I'm very interested in spirituality, though, and my own beliefs is connected to that. But I'm not a traditionally religious person. But I still appreciate a great deal about the message here. There is something to be said for simply reminding people that what they're looking for is often surrounding them. And it is our ability to see it that makes all the difference. So it's not that the thing that we're seeking actually isn't there, it's that we can't clearly see it. And I think this could be applied to anything. It doesn't have to be about God. Not missing what's in front of you, for appreciating what you have, for stopping and taking notice. No matter what your belief system is, you have to take notice of what's surrounding you and what life is offering you, what the world is offering you. Every spiritual text or even self-help book, philosophy, everything about the human condition comes back to taking the time to be present and appreciate. And the problem is, if you're always looking for the answers, we still have to find a way to appreciate what we have. And on that note, it could also apply to our faith in ourselves and in questioning what we are actually seeking. Because when we are so often seeking the answer to our own happiness, for example, outside of ourselves, or the answer to our life outside of ourselves, we can become very unhappy. I think about years ago, I had this kind of personal revelation that life is not a problem to be solved by, acquiring anything external of myself. It's about the presence of mind, the presence of experience, about learning and growing and loving and, all of the things that make us most human. But it's so easy to be constantly looking outside of that. And in that process, you can do exactly what Michael says here. You can miss what is everywhere. That's the life. The thing you're looking ahead, or you're looking away, or looking forward, instead of looking at where you are and what's surrounding you, you can easily miss it. You can miss it. And that seems to me, at least, to be part of the point of this piece. So whether you take this piece as an especially religious or faith-driven piece, which it clearly is meant to be, or you want to find another meaning in it, I think a lot can be applied here, because ultimately, no matter who you are or what you believe in, the reminder to be grateful for what is here, to pay attention to what's being offered us, that is powerful. And that is something to hold on to. And in Michael's case, it was a belief in God. And this was his way of sharing that with the people of the world who had an interest in his work, who he knew would pick this up and read it. And what a beautiful thing that is, to share faith in such a way, without it being faith that is linked directly to a particular religion or a particular set of beliefs. And in that sense, it's kind of an inclusive message, because, like I said, we can all get something from that. So with that said, that will close what is a relatively short and simple discussion of this relatively short but very sweet parable by Michael Jackson. So I want to thank you all for listening and for joining me on this episode, and I look forward to reading more with you next week.